Today we got some more actual history about the United States Revolution. We will be reading about another attack on the Wyoming settlement of Pennsylvania following the massacre on July 3rd, 1778. This story will tell about the Slocum family and their little 5-year-old girl who was kidnapped by a marauding group of Delaware Indians near the site of the present courthouse in Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. So today's story takes place both in 1778 and again 60 years later in 1838 as Jospeh Pritts was compiling this book. A man in his 60s named Slocum told Jospeh Pritts his story about how he and his siblings set out from Pennsylvania to a remote section of Indiana to find their lost sister who had been kidnapped by the Indians 60 years before. The Lost Sister, Valley of Wyoming. After the battle and massacre, most of the settlers fled, but here and there a few stragglers returned from the mountains or wilderness, and in the course of 3 or 4 months, other cabins were going up over the ashes of their former homes, and quite a little neighborhood was collected. But the Indians kept prowling around on the mountains, now descending here and now there, killing this family, scalping that, or making it captive. At a little distance from the present courthouse of Wilkes Barre lived a family by the name of Slocum, upon whom the visitations of the Indians' cruelties were awfully severe. The men were one day away in the fields, and in an instant the house was surrounded by Indians. There were in it the mother, the daughter about 9 years of age, a son aged 13, another daughter aged 5, and a little boy aged 2.5. A young man and a boy by the name of Kingsley were present grinding a knife. The first thing the Indians did was to shoot down the young man and scalp him with a knife which he had in his hand. The 9-year-old sister took the little boy, 2.5 years old, and ran out of the door to get back to the fort. The Indians chased her just enough to see her fright, and to have a hearty laugh as she ran and clung to and lifted her chubby little brother. They then took the Kingsley boy and young Slocum, aged 13, and little Frances, aged 5, and prepared to depart. But finding young Slocum lame, at the entreaties of the mother they sat him down and left him. Their captives were then young Kingsley and the little girl. The mother's heart swelled unutterably, and for years she could not describe the scene without tears. She saw an Indian throw her child over his shoulder, and as her hair fell over her face, with one hand she brushed it aside, while the tears fell from her distended eye, and stretching out her other hand towards her mother, she called for her aid. The Indian turned into the bushes, and this was the last scene of little Frances. This image was probably carried by her mother to her grave. About a month after this, they came again, and with the most awful cruelties murdered the aged grandfather, and shot a ball in the leg of the lame boy. This he carried with him in his leg nearly 60 years to the grave. The last child was born a few months after these tragedies. What were the conversations? What were the conjectures? What were the hopes and fears respecting the fate of the little Frances? I will not attempt to describe. Probably the children saw that in all afterlife the heart of the stricken mother was yearning for the little one, whose fate was uncertain, and whose face she could never see again. As the boys grew up and became men, they were anxious to know the fate of their little fair-haired sister. They wrote letters, they sent inquiries, they made journeys through all the West and into the Canadas, if peradventure they might learn anything respecting her fate. 4 of these long journeys were made in vain. A silence deep as the deepest forest through which they wandered hung over her fate, and that for 60 years. My reader will now pass over 58 years from the time of this captivity, and suppose himself far in the wilderness, in the farthest part of Indiana. A very respectable agent of the United States is traveling there, and weary and belated, with a tired horse he stops at an Indian wigwam for the night. He can speak the Indian language. The family are rich, for Indians have horses and skins in abundance. In the course of the evening, he notices that the hair of the woman is light, and her skin under her dress is also white. She told him she was a white child, but had been carried away when she was a very small girl. She could only remember that her name was Slocum, and that she lived in a little house on the banks of the Susquehanna, and how many there were in her father's family, and the order of their ages, but the name of the town she could not remember. On reaching home, the agent mentioned the story to his mother. She urged and pressed him to write and print the account. Accordingly, he wrote and sent it to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, requesting that it might be published. By some unaccountable blunder, it lay in the office for nearly 2 years before it was printed, but last summer it was published. In a few days, he was off to seek his sister, taking with him his oldest sister, the one who had aided him to escape, writing to a brother who now lives in Ohio and who I believe was born after the captivity, to meet him and go with him. The two brothers and sister are now, as of 1838, on their way to see little Frances, 60 years after her captivity. After traveling more than 300 miles through the wilderness, they reach the Indian country, the home of the Miami Indian. 9 miles from the nearest white family, they find the little wigwam. "I shall know my sister," said the civilized sister, "because she has lost the nail of her first finger. You, brother, hammered it off in the blacksmith shop when she was 4 years old." They go into the cabin and find an Indian woman having the appearance of 75. She is painted and jeweled off and dressed like the Indians in all respects. Nothing but her hair and covered skin would indicate her origin. They get an interpreter and begin to converse. She tells them where she was born, her name, etc., with the order of her father's family. "How came your nail gone?" said the oldest sister. "My older brother pounded it off when I was a little child in the shop." In a word, they were satisfied that this was Frances, their long-lost sister. They asked her what her Christian name was. She could not remember. Was it Frances? She smiled and said yes. It was the first time she had heard it pronounced for 60 years. Here, then, they were met, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. They were all satisfied that they were indeed brothers and sisters, but what a contrast! The brothers were walking the cabin, unable to speak. The oldest sister was weeping, but the poor Indian sat motionless and passionless, as indifferent as a spectator. There was no throbbing, no fine chords in her bosom to be touched. When Mr. Slocum was giving me this history, I said to him, "But could she not speak English?" "Not a word." "Did she know her age?" "No, had no idea of it." "But was she entirely ignorant?" "Sir, she didn't know when Sunday comes." This was indeed the consummation of ignorance in a descendant of the Puritans. But what a picture for a painter would the inside of that cabin have afforded! Here were the children of civilization, respectable, temperate, intelligent, and wealthy, able to overcome mountains to recover their sister. There was the child of the forest, not able to tell the day of the week, whose views and feelings were all confined to their cabin. Her whole history might be told in a word. She lived with the Delawares, who carried her off till grown up and then married a Delaware. He either died or ran away, and she then married a Miami Indian, a chief, as I believe. She had 2 daughters, both of whom are married and live in the glory of an Indian cabin, skin cloths, and cowskin headdresses. Not one of the family can speak a word of English. They have horses in abundance, and when the Indian sister wanted to accompany her new relatives, she whipped out, bridled her horse, and then, a la Turk, mounted astride and was off. At night she could throw a blanket around her down upon the floor, and at once be asleep. The brothers and sister tried to persuade their lost sister to return with them, and if she desired it, bring her children. They would transplant her again on the banks of the Susquehanna, and of their wealth make her home happy. But no, the Indians had always been kind to her, and she had promised her late husband on his deathbed that she would never leave the Indians, and there they left her and hers. You can hardly imagine how much this brother is interested for her. He says he intends this autumn to go again on that long journey to see his tawny sister, to carry her some presents, and perhaps will go and petition Congress that if ever these Miamis are driven off, there may be a tract of land reserved for his sister and her descendants. His heart yearns with an indescribable tenderness for the helpless one, who 61 years ago was torn from the arms of her mother. Mysterious Providence, how wonderful the tie that can thus bind a family together, with a chain so strong that nothing can break its links. I will only add that nothing has ever been heard of the boy Kingsley. The probability certainly is that he is not living. This account, hastily and imperfectly given, I had from the lips of Mr. Slocum, the brother, and the same who was 2½ years old when little Frances was carried away. I believe I have altered nothing, though I have omitted enough to make the good part of an interesting volume. So that's it for this story from Jospeh Pritts' 1838 book, Incidents of Border Life. This story didn't mention it, but Frances Slocum's Indian name was Mackinac, and she lived for about 10 more years after her reunion with her family. I am now going to read a section from this article published in 1905 by the Indiana Quarterly Magazine of History. This article is called Sketch of Frances Slocum, and the author is simply listed with the initials GSC. This tells a little bit about what happened in the 10 years between 1837 and 1847 when Frances Slocum passed away. The white captive lived 10 years after this visit from her kindred, and died at her home on the Mississinewa in March of 1847, aged 74 years. Of a piece with the story of the White Rose of the Miamis is the account of her marriage to Shepenkana, the chieftain, which is as romantic as the fond fabrications of the Indian legend writers who love to talk about dusky mates. Mackinac found the young warrior by the wayside badly wounded, and he was taken to the lodge of her foster parents and nursed back to health. For a time he remained with them and, being a skilled hunter, furnished the family with meat. When he prepared to seek pastures new, they prevailed with him to stay permanently, and the presumably fair Mackinac was given him to wife. Some years ago, the question of preserving in a permanent way the memory of Frances Slocum and of the vanished race with which she was linked was agitated, and on the 17th of May, 1900, a handsome and substantial monument of white bronze was unveiled over her grave, near the village of Peoria in Miami County, Indiana. The branches of the Slocum family were represented by many members from Michigan, Ohio, and states further east, and remnants of the Miami tribe of Indians gathered for the occasion, some from their distant reserve in Kansas. In addition, a large attendance from the surrounding country made the occasion the more memorable, and served to promote a sentiment which we of Indiana might well cultivate. GSC. So that was from a sketch of her life published back in 1905. There are a few more books and articles on the life of Frances Slocum that have been published since she was taken from her family in 1778, right after the Wyoming Massacre led by Tory and Iroquois forces. It appears that the Delawares were the tribe who raided the Wyoming settlement in the weeks following the massacre of over 300 Continental soldiers. Here on this channel, we try to focus on reading from old books or else old journals or old Western magazines, because the history that is written today is really more social commentary than it is history. Often what passes for history at our top universities these days is just criticism of people who lived in the past, or else criticism of the way past historians conducted their work. Here is one example of some modern scholarship on the subject of Frances Slocum, a master's thesis that was published by Indiana University in 2022 by Elise Sage Schrader. This thesis is titled Remember Mackinac, the Forced Erasure of Indigenous Identity and Captivity Narratives, Historical Markers and Memorials in Indiana. Here is the abstract of this thesis. Historic monuments and markers can be found across the United States. There are always different motivations involving why they were placed and who or what is being acknowledged. Markers and memorials remembering a white woman named Frances Slocum recognize that she was taken by Delaware Indians in 1778 and eventually married a Miami chief before dying in Indiana in 1847. What the markers and memorials fail to show is the life of Mackinac, a Miami woman that was adopted by a Delaware family after being taken in Pennsylvania. Since being located by her white family, Mackinac's story has been retold, celebrated, and remembered as the story of Frances Slocum, a lost but now found sister. The memorialization of Frances Slocum and erasure of Mackinac began with the captivity narratives that told the story of Slocum from the perspective of her being lost and then found by her white relatives. Native captivity narratives began when the increased colonization of the North American continent led to conflict and violence between the white colonists and indigenous tribes. Popular narratives began as early as 1624 with Captain John Smith's General History. When captives shared their stories, it was a way to share information about the different cultures they had encountered, as well as created a division of white colonial cultural and indigenous cultures. Narratives like the one written about Mackinac focus on her white identity and family, and firmly emphasize any difference in dress, home, or demeanor. Mackinac is not recognized so much for the life she created among the Miami, as she is mourned for the life that she would have had with her white family. This dismissal of her indigenous identity continued onto her monuments and markers that refused to acknowledge her name or her legacy. To properly remember Mackinac's life and legacy, any potential monument or marker will need to disrupt the narrative previously presented in favor of centering her Miami identity. The rest of this thesis continues in a similar vein. There is much criticism of previous historians who have documented Frances Slocum's story. The author avoids mentioning how Frances Slocum came to live with an Indian tribe, and refers to Frances's family as her birth family. You can read this thesis for yourself online. There are some details about Frances Slocum's life mentioned throughout, but the style is very typical of modern critical theory. It's also unclear if the author of this thesis ever went to Frances Slocum's grave, where the monument raised for her remembrance in 1900 has her Indian name written in larger print than anything else on the gravestone. So what do you think about this thesis? Is the history written by university scholars of the present day better or worse than the history written by authors like Jospeh Pritts in his 1838 book? Let us know what you think in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV, and because we cover the history of people who lived much more difficult lives than we have to today, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then consider becoming a paid member on our Patreon page. Patreon members will have their chosen name listed at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.